Yo, what is poppin', my 420 army? It is your boy, the mighty 420, and yep, here's the official Outlast timeline for this channel. Making another one because I wanted to get all the stuff that was out there in the true accurate one and put it on this channel because I had to change some stuff every there, and we're gonna be remastering all the character lore episodes too. Even though two characters have already had remasters on the old channel, but either way, our expanded enhanced Outlast timeline. Yeah, I know. Because I did not copy GTA. They actually did sheer laziness for GTA for their expanded enhanced, because it proved that mine is what it should look like. So either way, just enough ranting and enjoy. September 17th to 18th, 2013. Wayland Park, a software engineer who has not been needed all day, heads into a server room and sends Miles Upshur, an investigative journalist, an email about illegal experiments being performed on patients at Mount Massive Asylum. Miles then sees the email and calls a cab to an airport immediately after seeing it. Shortly after Wayland hits the send button, a security guard tells him he's needed at the Morphogenic engine. Wayland runs to the engine control room and sits down at a computer where Steve, a scientist working for the Murkoff Corporation, tells him he needs to debug the monitor so they can view Eddie Gluskin, one of the patients at the asylum for Project Walrider. Others were William Hope and many other patients. While Wayland is working on the debugging process, Eddie is brought in and runs up to the glass separating the control room from the engine. This frightens Wayland and he jumps out of his chair. He sits back down after Steve and another security guard calm him down, and he manages to get the feed of Eddie working. Wayland leaves after he's told that he can do so. He runs back to the server room where he sent the email, only to find the big boss, Jeremy Blair, sitting next to the laptop. Wayland tries to flee, but three security guards manage to push him onto the ground. Jeremy then pretends Wayland volunteered for the Morphogenic engine program. The guards then beat Wayland until he's knocked out. Jeremy and the guards begin to carry Wayland until they run to a scientist named Andrew and his assistant and ask them to take Wayland to the asylum's hospital, which the scientists agree to do. After Eddie is finished in the pod, security guards are ordered to move Eddie to the asylum's male ward as a naked patient is brought in and placed in the pod next to the one Eddie was in. However, during his session, said patient ends up dying and the entire pod gets filled with blood. Jeremy comes to the control room and begins talking with Steve till they notice the blood-filled pod, unsure how it happened. After Jeremy leaves the control room, another patient is brought in, but this one is shirtless and has pants on. He also doesn't die during his session, but he ends up cracking his pod like Eddie did. Steve also tells the guards to bring two more patients down into the lab. After the third patient is done, a guard takes him and begins to move him to the asylum's prison block. Three guards from the male ward soon return and have a patient with an all-white face and another one with his hands missing. The two patients are placed in cells and another patient is brought in and placed in the next pod. This patient is blindfolded, missing a hand, and has to wear a straitjacket while he's being moved to a new location. The guards struggle to get him into the pod, but he's eventually placed into it and even manages to get through his session without cracking the pod. The patient is eventually moved to the prison block because of being in a straitjacket. The next patient is completely fine and manages to get through his session without reacting, but fails like all the patients who were before him. The patient is then moved to the male ward after his turn. Billy Hope is the next patient and is placed into his pod as two more patients are brought down to the lab. One has his whole face gone except for one eye and his mouth. The other patient is another shirtless one. Both patients are placed into the cells to wait their turns. When Billy is in his pod, he begins to make a lateral incision and manages to gain control of a paranormal entity called the Walrider. He uses the Walrider to kill the staff, which one guard one explosion opens all the cell doors. Many of the security guards witness this and are able to kill one by bashing its head against the wall, but the guard is killed by the Walrider and even leaves a dead doctor on the ground who was strangled. Jeremy takes the elevator up to the asylum's administration block and begins to chat with the receptionist up there until they receive a warning about the lateral incision. The guard is killed and Steve tries to handle the escaped patients but is killed along with the other scientists. The alarm is tripped and the door to access the cells begin to close, but all except one patient make it through. The patients in the Walrider begin killing all the staff while the patient who didn't make it through begins watching from the closed door. They even split up after getting into an airlock where some even managed to break a few staircases leading to the second floor. The patients regroup and make their way to the reception desk in the lab and eventually go to the elevator that leads to the admin block. In the male ward, Richard Traeger, a former Murkoff employee who was processed as a patient, is strapped to a drip with tubes going into his arm veins. He manages to break free and disattaches the drip from the rack it's on and wraps it around his upper arm. Eddie is brought into the male ward, but he grabs a patient named Dennis and begins to hold him hostage and makes Dennis's brothers kill the guards before they all head to the asylum's vocational block. Traeger then steals a sheet and ties it around his waist so his crotch is covered. He even finds a destroyed mask and puts it on while also putting on a pair of glasses with a monocle underneath. 2 hours after being knocked out, Waylon wakes up in a room in the asylum's hospital where he's strapped into a chair by Andrew and his assistant as they ready him to start the morphogenic engine program consultations. Andrew's assistant learns Billy made the lateral incision at the engine and warns him. The two scientists leave Waylon to be tortured by the therapy on the screen in front of him, but they end up getting killed. Billy then uses the Walrider to hack the restraints in the hospital, freeing Waylon. He then falls to the ground and watches the Walrider kill the patient in the cell next to him. After the room goes dark due to the screens turning off, Waylon then grabs a camcorder that was set up to film him, and after another patient comes in and opens up the cells, Waylon decides to put matters into his own hands and expose Murkoff. A cannibalistic patient named Frank Manera, who has lost 73 pounds, is being fed a selection of food by doctors. Frank was part of Project Walrider before he got weaker from not eating and was kept in the hospital. He manages to break free from his bed and trashes the room he was staying in while also grabbing an electric buzzsaw and killing the doctors. Frank then heads to the cafeteria and begins eating a body after hanging up bodies and stuffing the head into a microwave. Waylon runs down several hallways, seeing the patients brutally killing a doctor, and manages to get past the Walrider before entering the room. The patients give Waylon a chance to leave, and he does before getting chased. After crawling into a vent and spying on two security guards talking about a shortwave radio in the prison, he decides to go and find it. While Waylon is looking for the radio, he stumbles across Frank eating and the head explodes. Waylon leaves the cafeteria after Frank admits he loves the dead body. After Frank finishes eating the body, he tries to eat Waylon while he's searching the hospital. Waylon briefly escapes but is followed by a blindfolded patient who had escaped the hospital too. Waylon grabs a key in order for him to proceed through a locked door and escapes. At one point, Frank tries to cook Waylon in a furnace, but Waylon manages to escape. He eventually finds a gas-filled lock and tries to find a way to turn it off with Frank still stalking him, and eventually escapes through a series of vents. But Frank catches up to him. Waylon manages to turn off the gas and makes his way outside to the asylum's recreation area to escape from Frank. As Waylon is moving around the hospital, the escaped patients finally reach the admin block and begin to take on the staff up there. Jeremy Blair also runs out of the admin block just in time. A bunch of patients that escaped from the male ward in the prison block also arrive, with 3 patients heading down to room A115 to watch a static TV. An escaped patient from the prison block heads to a wheelchair, another one into the basement of the admin block. Another patient from the underground lab decides to camp in the bathroom on the 2nd floor. The other patients that came from the lab split up and head for the male ward and prison block alongside the asylum's abandoned female ward. One final patient heads into room A126 and camps there. They also shove one of the guards in the elevator and it breaks down because of holding the patients in their recklessness. In the prison block, 2 naked patients who have been talking to the pipes are also brothers manage to pick the locks on their cells and they manage to break out. The Walrider kills everyone in Block C before the two. In Block C before. Yeah. In Block D, a security guard is talking with a large asylum inmate named Chris Walker, who had chain restraint because he was very violent and ill-tempered. Chris manages to break out of his cell and grabs the guard while destroying his chains before chaining the guard to him and starting to patrol the prison block. He also wraps a destroyed harness around his wrists and ankles, and the guard's keys go flying for the other inmates to free themselves. Chris had been given the harness because of mutilations he caused on his face. A patient named Martin Archambaud manages to get out of his cell and puts on robes. Martin also didn't get any damage done to him. He also starts to worship the Walrider and begins paying messages to gather followers. The two twins even begin killing guards with the machetes they acquire. They also join Martin's group of followers for worshiping the Walrider and head out into the recreation area themselves. After the commotion, the admin block ends. Waylon heads into the recreation area in hopes of finding a way to the prison block to find the radio. While trying to find a way to the radio and seeing an entrance with a patient trying to break down the door before giving up, Waylon stumbles across the twins. He also sees some of the patients that broke out with Chris and alongside the twins, who the two previously escaped patients warn Waylon about Chris. The twins keep stalking Waylon until he ends up disrupting a basketball game where they head to the prison. Waylon then climbs up a series of ladders and finally makes it to the prison block himself. He then walks down a bunch of hallways, witnessing some of the patients being chased by the Walrider and a few other ones till he finds the radio. However, when Waylon attempts to call the police, Jeremy, who had been camping in the room, comes out of nowhere and destroys the radio. Jeremy then attempts to strangle Waylon to death until he hears Chris coming. Jeremy then leaves Waylon to be killed by Chris, who throws the guard he was dragging with him at the door and enters the room shortly afterwards. Jeremy also listens with his ear pressed up against the door Waylon came in till he can't hear anything. Waylon escapes from Chris, though, and sees Martin paint a writing on the wall for his group of followers. Waylon continues to explore until two security guards think Waylon's not human anymore, and Chris chases him out of the prison block and back outside. Chris then heads back and begins to make his way to the admin block. A patient in our room Waylon entered earlier picks the lock to escape from his arguing cellmate in the holding cells. Jeremy then strangles a patient to death before seeing Chris walk past the door to the bottom floor of the staircase and goes to the opposite direction from him. He then heads into the male ward and begins to scope around before heading into the courtyard. After Waylon jumps out of the window to escape Chris, he wanders around the asylum's drawing ground till he finds an electric fence. After turning off the power twice due to a patient trying to get him, he eventually goes through the fence and through a small building on the other side. He then walks through a small pond, finds a tower, and climbs to the top of it. Waylon then falls into the vocational block after a failed jump and gets stalked by Dennis, who is waiting for people to wander into the vocational block in order to give to Eddie. After escaping from him, Waylon finds Eddie again, but with a groom suit on. He is stalked by Eddie, but eventually gets his leg stabbed after falling down an elevator shaft. Waylon attempts to hide from Eddie, but he drags him into his lair and gasses him. Sometime after Waylon gets gassed, two Murkoff tactical teams come to secure the asylum. One comes to the admin block and the other in the underground lab, which is located 122 feet below the surface of the asylum. The admin block team gets slaughtered by Chris in one of the libraries. The soldiers' heads are stacked on the bookshelves, and Chris also impales the team leader Stevenson on an iron pole. The underground lab team ends up getting killed by the Walrider. Sometime after the library ambush, Miles finally arrives at the asylum with the email Waylon sent him. Miles looks for a way inside and climbs in through an open window where the light bulb dies out. Miles is then startled by a TV turning on by itself and the patient in the bathroom messing with him. Chris heads into room A203 and takes out a bunch of patients in there. One manages to escape and Miles sees him heading to the female ward or prison block. Miles then heads into the library and sees the bodies with Stevenson telling Miles to escape before dying. Miles leaves the library and sees Chris heading for room A205. He then wonders until Chris throws him out the window, where he meets Martin for the first time after being knocked out for a while. Miles then gets up and sees the patients watching TV and is ambushed by the wheelchair guy after grabbing the key card. He also sees the patient in room A126 run into room A125 before heading to the security room and trying to unlock the main doors as Stephenson instructed him to. During the process, Martin cuts the power and Chris jumps through the hole he threw Miles through and makes his way to the security room. He then breaks down the security room door to look for Miles before heading to room A125, where he finds the patient in there and kills him. Miles heads into the basement to turn the power back on, with the patient down there stalking him in the process. Once the power is turned back on, Miles tries to unlock the doors again, but is drugged by Martin and sees the underground lab team being killed before being fully knocked out. Chris leaves room A125 and begins to follow Martin and Miles from a distance, but eventually loses sight of them once they get in the prison block. Chris then turns the whole prison upside down looking for Miles. Jeremy heads back into the mail ward and hides in an office while arming himself with with his baton. In the prison, a patient manages to break out of his cell and runs into another cell with a patient in a straitjacket. The patients break a hole in the back wall of their cell and eventually the floor above them. They then trash the hallway and even take out a surviving guard. The unrestrained patient begins to engage with the guard's body after they kill him. Sometime later, Miles wakes up in the cell Martin stayed in, which also has graffiti sprayed all over it, before a random patient lets him out. He then sees the twins and begins to follow a trail of blood. Miles then activates an airlock while being stalked by another patient, and even sees another patient being a guard Waylon had met before entering the area Miles is in now. Chris returns to the cell he broke out of and decapitates another guard without noticing Miles up above grabbing a key card. Miles has to get past the twins in the showers before Chris finally finds them and breaks through an airlock, and even an explosion sends them into Block C. Miles escapes and wanders Block D before heading down into the sewers. Miles looks around and finds a map leading to two valves, with Chris stalking him, and eventually stumbles across him again in a large room that is filled with waist-deep water, and after wandering through many tight drains, passageways, and broken catwalks. After escaping from Chris by climbing up a ladder and continuing down more hallways, Miles eventually comes across the mail ward. He heads into the mail ward from a stairwell in the sewer and wanders into a treatment room where he's being chased by patients till he gets captured by Traeger, who even shows Miles the exit before taking him up an elevator. Traeger then cuts off Miles' right index and left ring fingers, intending on selling them. Miles escapes and looks for a key to operate the elevator with Traeger stalking him. After finding the key and getting the elevator working, Traeger tries to capture Miles again but gets crushed by the elevator in the process. A pyromaniac who escaped from the basement manages to get a fire going in a cafeteria and sits in it wanting to die. Pyro hopes the fire will destroy the nightmare the asylum had given him for the experiment. Miles escapes through a hatch in the elevator ceiling and finds Martin, who tells him to come outside. Miles then wanders into the burning cafeteria where he sees the pyromaniac talking about how he hated Murkoff. He even tells Miles to leave the kitchen, but he instead turns on a sprinkler system with Chris hunting him again. This enrages Pyro and he tries to kill Miles but is overpowered. Miles then eventually heads out into the courtyard. After heading out in the courtyard, Miles looks for a key to unlock a shed for him to continue. He also spots the Wall Rider a few times and barely manages to escape from Chris a few times as well. After Miles squeezes through a small hole that Chris cannot fit through, he enters the female ward. He then sees Father Martin after entering the female ward and heads down several hallways and up a broken staircase. Miles then heads to a laundry room and looks for the 3 fuses needed for it while being stalked by more patients. The body in the laundry chute falls after Miles puts the fuses in and opens the door. He heads down to grab the key and is chased after grabbing it. Miles heads to the 3rd floor and runs into the twins, who headed to the female ward after the shower room trap failed. He successfully avoids them and heads to another room with a broken floor. Miles accidentally drops his camcorder after a failed jump and has to retrieve it. After being chased yet again, Miles heads back to the administration block to look for Martin. Miles is able to sneak past Chris before he's told to look for a key in a theater. He wanders around the theater and finds the key for the third floor. The twins catch up and Miles manages to get to the third floor. Miles then grabs an elevator key after wandering down a hallway and traversing out of a window to get into a chapel. He then watches Martin get burned alive before leaving the chapel and then gets chased by Chris back to the elevator, which takes him to the underground lab. Martin managed to get the elevator working again while Miles was in the theater, and Chris calls it so he can get into the lab. Jeremy slips out of the mail ward and reaches the administration block, but realizes another tactical unit arriving. He misses his chance to get to safety, so he cuts himself with a glass shard and sits by the open doors. Miles enters the lab and wanders around until he sees a way out, but the wall rider chases him back and he nearly gets killed by Chris. However, before Chris is able to do so, the wall rider cheese grates him at a vent. Miles then encounters Rudolph Wernicke, who tells him that no one can escape while William Hope is alive and to kill him. Miles finds the morphogenic engine after being chased by the wall rider again. The wall rider still pursues him while he turns off the life support for the engine, which kills Billy, and the wall rider makes Miles its new host. Miles limps in pain towards the exit, but is ultimately shot by Murkoff PMCs accompanied by Wernicke. The wall rider then attacks the PMCs and kills them. Sometime between Miles dropping his camcorder and leaving the chapel, Waylon wakes up to see Eddie mutilating other patients, so he himself gets strapped to a table with a saw aimed at his nads. Eddie starts to perform a sex change on Waylon until he's ambushed by another patient, allowing Waylon to get his clothes back on and escape. He jumps out of a window after Eddie chases him towards it. He then sees a locked door leading to the mail ward and starts looking for a key. Eddie starts stalking him again until he finds the key and unlocks the door. At this point, Eddie yanks Waylon back and tries to hang him, but he keeps squirming until Eddie gets impaled on an iron rod. Waylon then heads back to the mail ward and witnesses the burning chapel alongside more PMCs standing around Traeger's body. The PMCs eventually head to the underground lab after the team down there warns them about the wall rider. Waylon heads to the lobby to see Jeremy sitting right in front of the door, and as he tries to leave, Jeremy stabs him in the abdomen and tries to kill Waylon before he is killed by the wall rider. Waylon then heads out to Miles' car and sees Miles and the wall rider swarm following him. He then gets the car turned around and floors it out of there, escaping from the asylum, which the incident turned out to be 100% fatal. Waylon then ditches Miles' car at some random town and even burns down his house before fleeing with his family into hiding. The twins, the pyromaniac, Dennis, Frank, and everyone else still in the asylum are all so killed by either the wall rider, the Murkoff PMCs, or their fellow inmates, while Merc Tactical secures the asylum and cleans it up. Elsewhere, Waylon is fully recovered and sits by a laptop with a man warning him about the dangers that will happen. Waylon then uploads the footage he captured at the asylum and closes the laptop.